Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. One of the key topics that Seneca devotes a lot of space to in his treatise on the happy life is the relationship, and you could even say contrast between, on the one hand, virtue, and on the other hand, pleasure. Both of these are proposed by some people as the main constituent of the happy or the good life, the life that human beings ought to pursue if they're being rational. So there are quite a few people in Seneca's time, also before him in ancient philosophy, and in our own present, who think that the good life or the happy life is one that is essentially measured in terms of pleasure and pain. And so we call these people hedonists, from the Greek term hedone, which means pleasure. And their orientation is to say, well, you want to enjoy as much pleasure and avoid as much pain as possible. So pleasure and pain become essentially the criteria for what counts as a good life. Now, virtue might be important so that you can avoid pains or reduce pains or endure pains, and so that you can rationally enjoy pleasure and get as much of it as possible. And that's really what the Epicureans, one of the main rival schools to the Stoics, who Seneca belongs to, are saying. But there's a lot of other people out there who are not as, let's say, restrained and rational as the Epicureans, and Seneca is in large part targeting them in this treatise. So he's going to begin with somebody who's saying something kind of along the lines of what Epicurus himself says in the text that we still have of him. We've lost most of Epicurus's writings. And this person says, I deny that anyone can live pleasurably unless at the same time he also lives morally, right? And he says something that can't be the case for mute animals or those who measure their good in terms of food. So it's not just an animalistic thing. And to live pleasantly here is jucunde vivere. And then interestingly, the term that he's using, that we're translating as living morally, is honeste, living, we could say honestly, living virtuously. Honestum is the Latin word for something that has intrinsic value, and it's often tied in or interpreted as, moral, just, rightly, all of those sorts of descriptors can apply to it. Now, Epicurus, in some of the writings that we have, and in things that other people say about Epicurus, will say that it is impossible to live pleasantly without at the same time living justly, which would be part of living morally, living prudently, also part of living morally, certainly for the Stoics and for other ancient virtue ethicists, and living well, kalos, which could indeed be translated, often is, as honestum. So this does seem to be somebody using Epicurus, right? And then Seneca goes on and he says, well, that's not really true. So that bit of Epicurus we're not accepting. Why not? He says, I'm saying I clearly and publicly declare, or this is actually the other person, without the addition of virtue, adiacta virtute, you cannot live a pleasurable life. And then Seneca says, wait a second.
Who doesn't know, so this is common experience, that the most foolish men are filled to the brim with pleasures, and their wickedness overflows with pleasurable things. Their mind accumulates perverted forms of pleasure in great detail. And he's going to go through a whole list. There's all sorts of pleasures they enjoy that a good person, a moral person, isn't even going to think about. So you can't live a pleasant life without living a moral life. That's clearly wrong, right? Foolish people have all kinds of pleasures. And so he's going to go on and give you some examples. Here we go. Arrogance, placing too great of a value on yourself, an inflated ego that towers over others, a passion for their own things that's blind and lacks foresight, overexuberance for trivial and childish reasons, also slanderousness, self-importance that enjoys delivering insults, a sluggish mind that's lazy and dissolute, dripping with delights and falling asleep on itself. And he says, virtue shakes these things off and evaluates pleasures before it admits them. And if it doesn't, evaluate them as good or coming from good sources, it's going to reject them. So Seneca is going to say, listen, you embrace pleasure, I restrain it. You enjoy it, I use it. You think pleasure is the highest good. That's what a hedonist thinks. I do not even think it's a good. You do everything for the sake of pleasure. I don't do anything for its sake. So that's a clear rejection of that attempt to use an Epicurean principle. So Seneca's not accepting everything. Then in section 12, he's going to say, an Epicurean or another hedonist might say that bad people will have trouble. It will go badly for them. Many things will come along that disturb the mind. Their intellects will be disturbed by beliefs that contradict each other. Again, seems to be coming from Epicurean sources. So Seneca says, sure, that's the case, but even while they're foolish and inconsistent and vulnerable to the pain of regret, they will still experience great pleasures. So this doesn't actually keep them from having pleasure, and they can actually be free of quite a few pains. He says, these men were as far removed from all pain as they were from a good mind. They were raving with a cheery insanity and smiling in their madness. So that's not going to be working either. He's going to go on a little bit further and talk about how people who are really just basically dissolute hedonists, right? Effusus in voluptates. Voluptas is pleasure. So effusus means, that they are indulging and they are enjoying a whole bunch of different pleasures. They're greatly getting that. And they get the virtues and vices wrong. How do they do that? He says, the dissolute hedonist, perpetually drunk and belching because he knows he's living with pleasures, on hearing that pleasure is inseparable from virtue, falls into a mistake. He believes that he is actually living with virtue too. Then he gives his own vices the title of wisdom. And, he says they don't indulge in luxury at the urging of Epicurus, but because they're devotees of the vices, they conceal their luxury in philosophy's lap and make a beeline for wherever they hear pleasure is praised. So they're using Epicurus as sort of a cover for their indulgence in pleasures. And here we can go on. He tells us that Epicurus, and this is actually, I think, quite right, the way that he understands pleasures is much more sober and temperate, interestingly. So, the word for sober is basically a transliteration of the Latin. But temperate here, we're translating sicca, dry. So these aren't wet pleasures, right? They're sort of restrained, right? And he's going to go on and start praising Epicurus against his own school. So what we see here, he says, I am of the opinion, though my fellow Stoics would be unwilling to say what I say, Epicurus's teachings are sacred, sancta, right, recta, and we translate this as sobering, tristia. Now, tristia is an interesting term because it means gloomy or sad or something like that. So how can a pleasure be that way? Well, it's not the kind of pleasure that a out-and-out hedonist engages in. It's actually something a bit more, we could say, a bit more anemic, right? So Epicurus's teachings are like this, he says. And he says the fact is his pleasure is restrained to a small and meager amount. Now, Epicurus himself, in the way he lived his life, was not a big indulger in pleasures. We read, for example, that if somebody really wanted to get on his good side, they'd bring him a little pot of his favorite kind of cheese as he sat in the garden, and he would supplement his bread and water. He didn't drink wine with that cheese, and he'd say, oh, this is wonderful. I'm really enjoying myself. Well, that's a pretty small pleasure, right? Especially for those who live a life of luxury where they got to have all the special sauces and desserts and make themselves throw up so they can eat some more and enjoy that, right? That's the opposite of Epicurus. Epicurus also was not big on sexual pleasure and desire, so that gets you in trouble, He counsels against luxury and dress and all sorts of other things. Seneca goes on and he says that Epicurus imposes the same law on pleasure as we do on virtue. So what does that mean? So the Stoics are, and he uses this term lex, law here, meaning, sort of a way of governing ourselves. So the Stoics are saying, we need to actually understand virtue, we need to pursue the virtues, don't consider ourselves to be virtuous until we actually are. Imposing the same law on pleasure would presumably include actually needing to understand what pleasure is, what pain is, and Epicurus offers teachings on that go way beyond what the typical run-of-the-mill hedonist has to say about it. He also says that Epicurus commands pleasure to obey nature. Quite true from the texts that we have. Epicurus says that if we just stick to what is necessary and natural, or even what is not necessary but at least is natural, we're going to be okay. It's when we start allowing ourselves to be motivated by what he calls vain desires or empty desires, right? And opinions about what's good for us and what's bad for us. That's when we get ourselves into all sorts of trouble. And so he says that Epicurus's pleasures are, going to be sufficient for nature, but insufficient for luxury, right? So what's the contrast here? He says, whenever somebody uses happiness, felicitas, to refer to inactive leisure and alternations of gluttony or lust, he's seeking for a good authority for a thing that is bad. And so this is what a lot of people are doing. They're not actually following Epicurus. They're saying, I'm an Epicurean, so I'm going to go eat like a pig and find myself somebody to screw and just do whatever it is that is going to make me feel good. And Epicurus would come along and say, wow, man, that's not at all what I'm telling you to do. That's actually irrational. It's going to lead you to more pain and suffering as a result. And they can be like, well, I feel good right now, so, I'm following your doctrine. And again, Epicurus would say, no, you're not actually. So Seneca goes on, and he says, I will not say what most of my fellow Stoics say, that Epicurus' sect is a teacher of misdeeds. But I will say it is called names and is infamous, but why is this the case? And here we get an interesting contrast between the interior and exterior. And Seneca is going to talk about a brave man dressed up in women's clothing. You're confident of your respectability. Your masculinity is intact. Your body's not exposed to suffering anything disgraceful. But you have a tambourine in your hand, a tambourine being associated with, playing as a woman and things like that. And so the Epicureans, if you actually knew what it is that they're saying, because you've read their texts, you're participating in that lifestyle, you wouldn't lump them in with the other hedonists. But from the outside, they do look like the other hedonists, particularly since the other hedonists are using Epicurean philosophy as a cover for their indulgence in and pursuit of all sorts of pleasures, calling what they're doing pursuing virtue when they're really indulging in vices. So Seneca here is taking a very interesting position as a Stoic, saying, the Epicureans aren't really that bad. But he's not going to entirely endorse their position precisely because they are still turning virtue into something that you pursue and cultivate so that you can have pleasure. Pleasure for the Stoics and for Seneca is not the good. It's not the purpose of human life. Virtue is instead. But the Epicureans are not as far away from that as many other Stoics would like to think that they are. And so Seneca is providing a kind of limited defense of them here in this work.